The surviving punishment book from Catford Central School for Boys in London provides a detailed record of corporal punishment administered between 20th of February 1953 and 27th February 1956. As a historical document, it offers an opportunity to examine not only individual punishments, but also broader disciplinary practices within an English secondary school during the early 1950s. Rather than viewing each entry in isolation, the records allow for statistical analysis of how caning was used, whether consistent disciplinary patterns existed, and whether particular offences or pupils received noticeably different treatment. At first glance, the entries appear highly varied and almost random. However, closer examination suggests that, while no formal written policy survives explaining how punishments were determined, there were nevertheless recognisable practices and informal conventions followed by members of staff. It is important to recognise that this analysis describes historical school practices and should not be interpreted as an endorsement of corporal punishment. Instead, the figures help illustrate how discipline was administered within one school during a period when caning remained a legally accepted educational sanction in Britain. The Punishment Book. The Punishment Book consists of 90 pages, containing 1,710 recorded incidents involving 594 individually identifiable boys, aged between 11 and 16 years. Every recorded punishment consisted of caning, with penalties ranging from 1 stroke to a maximum of 6 strokes. The average punishment was 2 strokes. The records also note where the punishment was administered. Seat, buttocks, 1 to 532 incidents, 90%. Hands, 178 incidents, 10%. This overwhelming preference suggests that caning on the seat was regarded as the standard form of punishment throughout the period. Frequency of punishment. The punishment book covers a period of approximately 3.02 years. During that time, 1,710 punishments were recorded. This represents an average of 596 punishments each year. Assuming approximately 180 school days annually, the school averaged just over 3 canings per school day. These figures demonstrate that corporal punishment formed a routine element of disciplinary practice, rather than being reserved only for exceptional cases. Because the surviving register covers only part of each pupil's school career, it is impossible to follow every individual from admission until leaving school. Consequently, any analysis of long-term behavioural change or eventual outcomes remains incomplete. How often were individual boys canned? Among the 594 identifiable boys, the average number of recorded punishments was approximately 2.9 incidents per pupil. However, averages conceal considerable variation. Most pupils appeared only once or twice in the punishment book, suggesting that for many boys caning was an occasional disciplinary measure rather than a recurring experience. A much smaller group appeared repeatedly, accounting for a disproportionately large share of the total entries. These pupils were evidently regarded as persistent disciplinary problems under the school's disciplinary system. The average punishment remained remarkably consistent at approximately 2 strokes per incident, even among repeat offenders. Estimating the proportion of pupils punished. One limitation of the surviving records is the absence of enrollment data. Without knowing how many pupils attended the school during these years, it is impossible to determine precisely what proportion experienced corporal punishment. For illustration only, if the school enrolled approximately 1,000 pupils, admitted roughly 200 new boys each year, and therefore educated about 1,800 individual pupils during the 3-year period, then the 594 boys identified in the punishment book would represent roughly 1/3 of all pupils. Although entirely hypothetical, such an estimate illustrates how widespread corporal punishment may have been within the school community. Persistent repeat offenders. 3 pupils stand out as receiving substantially more punishments than anyone else. The most frequently punished boys accumulated the following records: 24 recorded incidents, receiving 57 strokes in total, average 2.4 strokes per punishment. 24 recorded incidents, receiving 72 strokes, average 3.0 strokes. 23 recorded incidents, receiving 41 strokes, average 1.8 strokes. These figures suggest markedly different approaches to disciplining individual pupils. Although the number of incidents was almost identical, the severity of punishment varied considerably, indicating that the number of strokes was influenced by factors beyond simple repetition alone. Whether these differences reflected the seriousness of offences, individual teachers' preferences, or assessments of behaviour cannot be determined from the surviving records. A notable case of early recidivism. One particularly striking case involved an 11-year-old pupil who had already accumulated 13 separate punishments, receiving 26 strokes in total before completing his first year recorded in the punishment book. This equates to an average of approximately 1 caning every month, with punishments ranging from 1 to 3 strokes. From a modern educational perspective, this raises important questions regarding the effectiveness of repeated corporal punishment as a behavioural intervention. Rather than reducing misconduct, repeated punishment appears, at least in this case, to have coincided with continuing disciplinary difficulties. While the records do not reveal the underlying causes of the boy's behaviour, they suggest that repeated physical punishment alone was insufficient to produce lasting behavioural change. Today, educational professionals would generally seek to identify underlying social, emotional, family, or learning factors contributing to persistent misconduct, and would employ a broader range of behavioural support strategies rather than relying solely upon repeated punishment. Where the caning was administered. Across all 1,710 recorded incidents, 1,532 punishments, 90%, were administered to the seat. 178 punishments, 10%, were administered to the hands. This consistent 9-to-1 ratio indicates a clear institutional preference. When the data are divided by age group, no significant variation emerges. Pupils aged 11 through 16 all experienced broadly similar proportions, with between 85% and 95% of punishments administered to the seat. This suggests that age was not a determining factor in selecting where the punishment would be applied. Teacher practices. The punishment book records disciplinary actions carried out by a number of teachers and senior staff. Analysis suggests that approximately 80% of recorded punishments were administered by female members of staff, while approximately 20% were administered by male staff. Although individual disciplinary styles naturally varied, the overall statistical patterns remained remarkably consistent across the teaching staff. No convincing evidence suggests that either male or female teachers consistently favoured caning on the hands or the seat. Likewise, no particular category of offence appears to have dictated the location of punishment. Instead, the available evidence indicates that this decision largely rested upon the judgment of the individual teacher or senior member of staff dealing with each incident. Severity of punishments. One of the clearest patterns concerns the relationship between the number of strokes and where they were administered. Punishments involving more than 2 strokes on the hands were extremely uncommon. Even when 2 strokes were ordered, the punishment book frequently included notes such as 1 on each hand, suggesting that staff regarded 2 strokes as the practical upper limit for hand caning. By contrast, the most severe punishments were reserved exclusively for caning on the seat. The records contain 30 occasions on which 6 strokes were administered, and every one of these was delivered to the seat. For statistical purposes, one isolated 5-stroke entry was grouped with the 6-stroke punishments because of its rarity. This clear distinction suggests an unwritten convention whereby hand caning was reserved for relatively minor punishments, while the seat was regarded as the appropriate location for the most severe disciplinary sanctions. Identifying individual pupils. Historical records inevitably present challenges in identifying individuals accurately. Some pupils appeared under slightly different spellings or shortened versions of their names, for example, a formal name appearing on one occasion and a familiar version on another. Fortunately, the punishment book usually includes the pupil's age and class, allowing many such entries to be confidently matched. Where spellings differed more substantially, identification could often be confirmed through combinations of class placement, age, and the names of other pupils punished during the same incident. These contextual details make it possible to reconstruct individual disciplinary histories with a high degree of confidence, despite occasional inconsistencies in record keeping. Conclusion. The Catford Central School Punishment Book offers an unusually detailed statistical record of everyday disciplinary practice during the early 1950s. Several clear patterns emerge from the data. Caning was administered frequently, averaging more than 3 incidents for every school day. Most boys recorded in the register were punished only once or twice, while a relatively small minority accounted for a large proportion of repeat entries. Caning on the seat overwhelmingly predominated over hand caning, regardless of the pupil's age, and the most severe punishments were reserved exclusively for the seat. Teachers appear to have exercised considerable personal discretion, particularly regarding the number of strokes and the location of punishment, although common unwritten conventions are evident throughout the records. Perhaps the most significant observation concerns persistent repeat offenders. The records demonstrate that repeated corporal punishment did not invariably prevent further misconduct. In several cases, pupils continued to receive regular punishments over extended periods, suggesting that physical punishment alone was often insufficient to resolve underlying behavioral difficulties. Viewed through a modern educational lens, these records illustrate both the routine nature of corporal punishment in mid-20th century British schools and the limitations of relying upon it as the primary response to persistent disciplinary problems.